She fled the mafia boss's mansion at 2 o'clock in the morning with the child in her arms. Not because she wanted ransom money, but because if she didn't run, the little girl wouldn't live to see tomorrow morning. And the person who wanted the child dead was her father's fiancé. That night, Meredith Cole held the 4-year-old girl tightly against her chest and ran through the garden, black as ink. Behind her, Blackwood Manor still blazed with light like a palace, its towering glass windows reflecting the cold glow of the moon. Within those walls lived power, wealth, and an entire underground empire that made people tremble in fear. But within those same walls, a dark conspiracy was waiting for dawn to swallow the life of this innocent child. Meredith wasn't a kidnapper. She was a nanny, hired to care for and protect Phoebe Blackwood. But tonight, that very house had become the most dangerous place in the world for the little girl. She wasn't running for money. She was running because 20 minutes earlier she had heard something she was never meant to hear. A phone call, a plan, a death sentence for the child now sleeping in her arms. Meredith's breathing came fast and sharp, and her heart pounded so hard it felt as though it might burst from her chest. Phoebe stirred softly, her brown eyes opening to look at Meredith in the darkness, but she didn't cry, didn't ask a single question. As though that 4-year-old child understood by instinct that silence, in this moment, meant survival. Meredith held her even tighter, crossed the last fence, and stepped into the vast and uncertain night. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know how she could possibly stand against an empire. She only knew that if she did nothing, this child would die. And once, she herself had been the child no one came to save. She wouldn't let that happen to someone else. But why would an ordinary nanny dare to risk her life like this? What had happened inside that mansion that forced her to make a choice from which there could be no return? And when the most powerful mafia boss on America's East Coast discovered that his daughter had vanished, could Meredith possibly escape the gaze of a man who seemed to control the entire underworld? To understand why that night unfolded the way it did, we need to go back 3 months earlier, to the moment Meredith Cole first stepped into the world of Jasper Blackwood. If this story touches your heart, please press like to support us. Share this video with those who need to hear this story, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the dramatic turns still waiting ahead. 3 months before that fateful night, Jasper Blackwood stood on the 3rd-floor balcony of his mansion, looking down at the empire he had built with blood and calculation over the course of nearly a decade. At 33 years old, he possessed everything most people could ever dream of, from power and wealth to the fear that lived in the eyes of his enemies. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, with broad shoulders carved by years of violence and discipline, Jasper carried the appearance of an elite businessman, yet his eyes told a different story. Those deep blue eyes were as cold as an American winter, as if they had never known the warmth of human feeling. A faint scar ran from his left temple down to his cheekbone, the mark left behind by the battle for power when he was 25, when he had been forced to cleanse his world with his own hands and destroy the men who had poisoned his father. People called him the architect, because every move he made was calculated 10 steps ahead. He never gave orders in anger, and he never acted on instinct. Every decision was cold, precise, and lethal. In the underworld, there was one rule everyone knew about Jasper Blackwood: you didn't touch women or children. Anyone who broke that rule vanished without a trace. The Blackwood Empire stretched along the east coast of the United States, controlling shipping routes, container ports, and certain special services that ordinary people were never meant to know existed. His mansion stood 2 hours outside Boston, hidden deep within a private forest that covered hundreds of acres. The place was nothing less than a fortress, with surveillance cameras in every corner, security teams patrolling around the clock, reinforced steel doors, and a protection system powerful enough to make the White House jealous. Everything lay under Jasper's absolute control. Everything except one thing: Phoebe. His daughter had just turned 4 years old, with curly black hair that looked exactly like his, though her warm brown eyes had come from her mother. The only woman Jasper had ever loved had died while giving birth, leaving him with a newborn child and a hollow space in his chest that nothing had ever been able to fill. Jasper loved his daughter in his own way. He gave Phoebe everything of the finest kind, from a room overflowing with toys to a carefully selected staff of nannies. But he kept his distance, not because he was cold, but because he was afraid. He feared that closeness would turn his daughter into a target. He had watched his own mother be assassinated right before his eyes when he was 12 years old. He wouldn't allow history to repeat itself. But as he watched Phoebe grow up in silence, smiling little, speaking little, Jasper began to understand that the child needed more than safe walls. She needed a mother. That was when the Ashford family from Chicago proposed an alliance. Genevieve Ashford, their daughter, was 29 years old, flawlessly beautiful, and born of a bloodline Jasper believed he could trust. A political marriage would strengthen the power of both families, and more importantly, Phoebe would have someone to care for her. Jasper agreed. He didn't love Genevieve, and he didn't need love. He needed a solution, and she seemed to be the safest choice. Genevieve moved into the mansion, smiled at the right moments, said the right things, and played the role of future mother with perfect grace. Jasper watched her beside Phoebe and believed he had made the right decision. He didn't know that it would become the greatest mistake of his life. Everything seemed perfect. Everything seemed to remain under control. Until the day Meredith Cole stepped into Blackwood Manor. Meredith Cole received the call from the agency on a bleak Monday morning, while she sat in her tiny studio apartment on the outskirts of Boston, watching rainwater slide down the only window in the room. The apartment was less than 20 square meters, just large enough to hold a narrow bed, a small table, and a few cardboard boxes stacked neatly in the corner. Everything she owned could be packed in 20 minutes, a survival habit shaped by 18 years of never truly having any place to call home. At 26 years old, Meredith had the kind of face people forgot easily. Chestnut brown hair fell to her shoulders, her skin was pale from too little sunlight, and her slender frame carried a quiet hardness hidden inside every movement. Only her gray-blue eyes were different. They no longer held hope or expectation, only the silent watchfulness of someone who had seen too much of life's darkness. When she was 8 years old, Meredith woke in the middle of the night to the sound of screaming and the smell of smoke. The fire consumed the small suburban house along with her parents. She was the only one who survived, pulled from the wreckage with burned skin and a shattered heart. After that, she entered the foster care system like an object being moved from one shelf to another. 7 foster families in 10 years. Some were indifferent and treated her like invisible furniture. Some were cruel and used her like a punching bag for their anger. She learned how to move without making a sound, how to recognize the signs of danger before it came, how to survive by becoming invisible. At 18, she left the system with one small bag and not a single dollar to her name. She put herself through college by working 3 jobs at once, sleeping on buses between shifts, eating leftovers from the restaurant where she washed dishes. In the end, she earned her degree, found a steady job as a nanny, and met a man who said he wanted to build a future with her. For the first time in her life, Meredith allowed herself to hope. Then, 2 weeks before the wedding, his car crossed the highway median. She didn't reach the hospital in time. She only arrived in time to claim his body. After the funeral, Meredith returned to the empty apartment, looked at the wedding dress hanging in the closet, and understood one thing with absolute clarity. She had nothing left to lose. No family, no loved ones, no future. Only herself, and the survival instinct sharpened by 26 years of pain. When the agency called to offer her a nanny position for an elite family at a salary 5 times higher than normal, Meredith knew something was wrong. No one paid that much unless there was risk involved. But she took the job, because when you have nothing left to lose, you also have nothing left to fear. The interview took place in Jasper Blackwood's study, a room of oak and leather that carried the scent of power and danger. Jasper sat behind the desk, his deep blue eyes sweeping over her as though he were reading a file. He didn't ask about experience. He didn't ask about qualifications. He asked only one question, his voice low and cold. "Are you willing to do whatever it takes to protect my daughter?" Meredith looked straight into his eyes, something she quickly realized very few people ever dared to do. "I don't know how to do anything except protect children. No one else protects." Jasper was silent for a moment. Something in his gaze shifted, almost too subtly to notice, as though her answer had touched something he hadn't expected. Then he nodded. She was hired. That was also the moment Meredith met Genevieve Ashford for the first time. The woman entered the room with a smile so perfect it felt programmed, golden hair gleaming, lips red as blood, and a dress expensive enough to equal an entire year of Meredith's salary. Genevieve greeted Jasper with sweetness so carefully measured it felt rehearsed, then let her gaze pass over Meredith the way one might glance at a piece of furniture too ordinary to notice. In that brief moment when their eyes met, Meredith felt something the coldness hidden behind that smile, the calculating look beneath the false warmth. The survival instinct honed through years of pain told her that something wasn't right, but she didn't yet know what it was, and she didn't ask. Meredith simply lowered her head and followed the housekeeper to her room, never knowing that from this very moment on, she had stepped into a deadly game. She didn't know that she was about to become the only shield standing between an innocent child and the death already waiting inside that very house. On her first day at Blackwood Manor, Meredith was led to the playroom to meet Phoebe. The room was vast, filled with expensive toys arranged in perfect order on polished shelves, yet there wasn't a single sign that any of them had ever truly been touched. Phoebe sat in the corner by the window, holding an old teddy bear worn thin with age. The 4-year-old girl lifted her head and looked at Meredith with brown eyes, far too old for someone so young. She didn't smile, didn't say hello, only watched. Meredith recognized that look at once. It was the gaze of a child who had already learned that the world wasn't safe, that grown-ups could disappear at any moment, and that trusting someone was a dangerous risk. She had once carried that same look herself, many years earlier, in those cold foster homes. Meredith didn't try to force Phoebe into conversation. She simply sat down beside the window, leaving just enough space between them, took a book from the shelf, and began to read aloud. She didn't ask whether Phoebe wanted to listen, didn't demand any response. She just read, her voice steady and unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. On the second day, Phoebe was still silent, but she sat a little closer. On the third day, the child began to glance at the pages Meredith was reading. On the 5th day, Phoebe chose a book herself and placed it beside Meredith, a quiet request that didn't need to be spoken aloud. By the end of the first week, Meredith understood that Phoebe wasn't a distant child. She was simply a child who had been wounded, who had lost her mother before she was even old enough to understand what a mother was, and who lived with a father who loved her, yet always kept his distance. This little girl longed for closeness, yet feared that closeness would be taken away from her all over again. On the last night of the 2nd week, Meredith was awakened by the sound of soft crying coming from Phoebe's room. She hurried there and found the child curled up on the bed, eyes wide with terror, tears rolling down her cheeks. A nightmare. Meredith didn't turn on the light, didn't ask questions. She simply sat down by the bed, let her hand rest quietly on the edge of the mattress, and began to sing in a low voice. The song she sang was the one her mother had once sung before the fire, the only melody she still remembered from childhood. A gentle lullaby about stars and peaceful dreams. She didn't know why she sang that song. She only knew it was the one thing she still had to give. And then a tiny hand reached for hers. Phoebe didn't say a word, only held on tight, as though she feared Meredith would vanish the moment she let go. Meredith stayed there through the entire night, singing the same song again and again until the child finally drifted back to sleep. And in that moment, she knew everything had changed. In the days that followed, life on the surface inside the mansion seemed perfect. Jasper appeared at dinner, took his seat at the head of the table, and asked Phoebe a few brief questions about her lessons and her health. Genevieve sat beside him, smiling at exactly the right moment, saying exactly the right thing, playing the role of devoted fiancée and future mother so flawlessly that no one could have found fault in it. Everything seemed fine, but Meredith watched. She noticed that Genevieve never looked at Phoebe unless Jasper was watching her. She noticed that the woman's smile vanished the instant Jasper turned away. She noticed the little details others ignored. By the 3rd week, when Jasper had begun spending more time away at work, Genevieve changed. The sweet performance disappeared. The woman shut herself away in her private rooms all day, never came down to the floor where Phoebe was, and didn't even bother pretending to care anymore. And whenever Meredith walked Phoebe through the hallway, Genevieve would glance at the child with an icy look before turning away. One day, Genevieve called Meredith over, her voice sugary and smooth, yet edged with command. "Keep the child quiet. I don't want to be disturbed." Meredith nodded and said nothing, but she began to take note. Phoebe's meals grew smaller after Genevieve spoke with the cook. The child's time in the garden was cut short on the excuse that the weather wasn't suitable, even though the sun still poured down brilliantly outside. Then one day, Phoebe's favorite teddy bear was found torn wide open, though no one could explain why. Phoebe began to change. She no longer ran freely through the house. She started hiding behind Meredith whenever she heard the sharp click of Genevieve's heels in the hallway. She learned to take the long way around, avoiding any room where the woman's shadow might appear. One night, While Meredith was singing Phoebe to sleep, the little girl spoke in a trembling whisper. "She looks at me like she wants me to disappear." Meredith pulled the child closer, her heart tightening painfully inside her chest. This wasn't ordinary indifference. This was deliberate hatred, carefully hidden beneath a mask of manners and grace. Meredith tried speaking to the housekeeper, the middle-aged woman who had served the Blackwood family for more than 10 years. She chose her words with care, saying perhaps Miss Ashford wasn't used to children, that Phoebe seemed frightened. The housekeeper looked at her with a warning in her eyes. "Just do your job. Don't interfere in the affairs of your betters." Meredith understood. In this world, no one stood on her side. No one would believe the word of a newly hired nanny over the fiancé of the master of the house. She had no proof, no allies, no power. There was only one thing she could do: wait and watch. Because Meredith knew, deep in her bones, that something was terribly wrong inside this house. She just didn't yet know how wrong it truly was. Dinner that evening began like every other dinner. But Meredith knew the moment Jasper walked into the dining room that something was different. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit instead of his usual shirt, and a leather briefcase had already been placed by the door. Jasper sat down at the head of the table, looked at Phoebe for a long moment, and only then spoke. "I have to go to Las Vegas for 5 days. There is important business that needs to be handled." Phoebe looked up, and a flicker of worry passed through her brown eyes, but the child said nothing. She only lowered her gaze to the plate of food in front of her, food she had barely touched. Genevieve sat across from him and placed her hand on Jasper's arm with the kind of affection that felt perfectly rehearsed. "I will take care of everything at home. You can focus on work without worrying." Jasper nodded, never noticing the way Genevieve glanced at Phoebe for the briefest instant when he turned to speak to the housekeeper. Meredith noticed. That look was colder than anything she had ever seen, like the gaze of someone staring at an obstacle that needed to be removed. The next morning, Jasper left before the sky had fully brightened. Meredith brought Phoebe down to the front entrance to say goodbye. Jasper knelt until he was level with his daughter's eyes and pressed a kiss to the child's forehead. "Be good. I will be home soon." Phoebe wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, as though she didn't want to let go. But Jasper gently loosened her grip, stood up, and walked out the door without looking back. The polished black car rolled down the long drive, growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared beyond the final bend. Meredith stood there, her hand wrapped tightly around Phoebe's, with the terrible feeling that the last layer of protection had just been stripped away. The mansion suddenly became quiet in a completely different way, not with ordinary stillness, but with a heavy, threatening silence, like the air before a storm. Genevieve didn't wait long to change. On the very first morning, she summoned the cook into the sitting room, her voice sweet but hard as steel. "From now on, the child eats in her own room. I don't want to see her on the main floor." When Meredith led Phoebe through the hallway, Genevieve stopped her with one sharp look. "Keep her out of my way. Do you understand?" Meredith nodded and swallowed the words rising in her throat. The first 24 hours passed like a nightmare that wouldn't end. Phoebe was isolated in her bedroom and the playroom, not allowed into the garden, not allowed onto the main floor, as though the child were a prisoner inside her own home. Meredith stayed beside Phoebe every second, trying to turn the situation into an adventure. "Let's build a fortress out of pillows. Then we can pretend you are a princess trapped inside a tall tower." Phoebe gave a faint little laugh, but her eyes were still full of worry. "She hates me, doesn't she, Mary?" Meredith pulled the child close, her heart aching as if someone's hand were squeezing it shut. "No one is allowed to hate you. Do you hear me? No one." But even as she said those words, Meredith knew the truth was far crueler than that. Every time the sound of Genevieve's high heels echoed through the hallway, Meredith held her breath. The survival instinct from her childhood had awakened, pulling her back into those foster homes, into those nights when she lay frozen in the dark, listening to the footsteps of adults and praying they wouldn't open her door. Meredith recognized the signs of danger. She had once been the child no one protected. She knew when a child was being threatened. On the second night, at around 11 o'clock, Meredith was jolted awake by the sound of voices in the hallway. Genevieve was on the phone, and her voice carried through the empty mansion. Meredith couldn't make out the whole conversation. She caught only fragments of words, and then a laugh. That laugh sent a chill straight through her bones. It wasn't the laugh of someone amused. It was the laugh of someone winning a game no one else even knew was being played. Meredith lay back down and closed her eyes, but she couldn't sleep. A feeling of dread wrapped itself around her like darkness, heavy and impossible to shake off. She didn't know that tomorrow night, everything would change. What she was about to hear would force her to make a decision from which there could be no return. On the third night since Jasper had left, Meredith was awakened by laughter. Not the ordinary kind of laughter people let slip when they are watching a comedy or receiving good news. This was a different kind of laughter. The laughter of someone celebrating victory, smug and triumphant, echoing through the silent mansion like an alarm bell. Meredith lay still in bed, her eyes wide open in the darkness, her heart already beginning to race. The clock on the wall read 11 o'clock at night. The laughter came again, faint and distant from the downstairs hallway. The survival instinct sharpened by 26 years of suffering suddenly woke inside her, growling in her chest like a wild animal catching the scent of danger. Something wasn't right. Meredith slid out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. She moved through the darkness, with the skill of someone who had once survived by learning how to become invisible. Habits from her foster care years came back as though they had never left. Each step placed with care, avoiding the floorboards that might creak, her breathing even and shallow. She opened her door and looked into the dark hallway. A pale yellow light spilled from the study at the far end of the first-floor corridor, the door left slightly open. Genevieve's voice drifted out, clear and confident, as though the woman never imagined anyone might be listening. Meredith made her way down the stairs, each step a gamble. Her heart pounded like war drums, but she didn't stop. She needed to know. She needed to understand why every instinct inside her was screaming that something terrible was about to happen. She stopped a few steps from the study door, pressed herself into the darkness, and listened. Genevieve's voice rose, sweet and venomous. Tomorrow night, when everyone is asleep, no one will suspect a thing. Then silence for a moment. The woman was listening to whoever was speaking on the other end of the line. Then she laughed softly, and that laugh made Meredith feel as though someone had poured ice water straight down her spine. A fall down the stairs. Children fall all the time, don't they? 4 years old, still unsteady. One little loss of balance and it will be over. Meredith covered her mouth with her hand, afraid even the sound of her breathing might carry through the deadly stillness. Genevieve went on, her voice as light as if she were discussing the weather. Jasper will be devastated, of course, but he will need me more than ever. There won't be anyone else for him to lean on. I will stay by his side, comfort him, and then, she laughed again, louder this time, and every note of it was thick with calculation. After the funeral, I will get pregnant. A son, the true heir to the Blackwood Empire. Not the child of some woman who died 4 years ago. The blood in Meredith's body seemed to freeze. She wanted to scream, wanted to burst into the room and strike that flawless face, but her legs wouldn't move. She could only stand there, hearing every word like a blade driven into her heart. Genevieve's voice dropped lower, but it was still clear enough for Meredith to hear. That child is nothing but an obstacle, and obstacles need to be cleared away. The world stopped for a few seconds. Meredith stood there with her hand clamped over her mouth, her heart pounding so hard it felt ready to burst from her chest. Phoebe. They were talking about Phoebe. The 4-year-old little girl was asleep upstairs, unaware that someone was calmly planning to end her short life. Meredith stepped backward, one careful step at a time, not daring to breathe. She turned and climbed the stairs as quickly as she could while still staying silent. Her legs were shaking, her hands were shaking, but she didn't stop until she reached Phoebe's room. She opened the door and looked inside. Phoebe was sleeping, her face peaceful, her arms wrapped around that old, worn teddy bear. The child had no idea that in only a few more hours, someone would come and turn this sleep into a permanent one. Meredith wanted to cry, wanted to scream, wanted to do anything to tear this nightmare apart, but she couldn't. Not now. She needed to think. She needed to act. She rushed back to her room, grabbed her phone, and dialed Jasper's emergency number, the one she had been given when she took the job. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. No answer. 1 o'clock in the morning in Las Vegas. He could have been in a meeting, asleep, or doing anything at all except answering a call from a nanny. Meredith called again a second time. Still no answer. A third time. Silence. She dialed the Blackwood family security line, the number she had been told to use only in a true emergency. A man's low, rough voice answered. Meredith spoke quickly, trying to keep her voice steady though her heart was pounding wildly. "I am Phoebe's nanny. I just overheard a phone call. Miss Ashford is planning to hurt her. You have to do something right now." Silence on the other end. Then the man's voice came back, cold and doubtful. "Do you have proof? Did you record it?" No, I only heard it." The man's voice hardened. "Without proof, don't make accusations against the boss's fiancé. Do you know what happens to people who falsely accuse someone in the Blackwood family?" But I heard her clearly. She said she was going to make Phoebe fall down the stairs tomorrow night. "We will file a report in the morning. For now, you should go back to sleep." "In the morning?" Meredith almost shouted. By morning, Phoebe could already be dead. The man let out a sigh, the irritated sigh of someone annoyed at being disturbed in the middle of the night. "Listen, I know you are new here. Maybe you are stressed, or maybe you imagine something, but Miss Ashford is Mr. Blackwood's fiancée. She is about to become the lady of this house. Who do you think people are going to believe? A nanny or her?" The line went dead. Meredith stared at the phone in her hand and felt the cruel truth settle over her, a truth she had known ever since she was an 8-year-old girl lying in a hospital bed, waiting for someone to come claim her. No one believed her. No one was coming to help her. She was alone, the way she had always been. Meredith sat down on the bed, her thoughts spinning. She had two choices: stay, wait for morning, hope someone would believe her, hope Genevieve would change her mind, hope for a miracle that never came. Or run, right now, take Phoebe out of this place before the sun rose. She looked toward Phoebe's room, where the child was still sleeping peacefully. Meredith had once been the child no one protected. She had once lain in the dark, praying for someone to come save her. No one came. She had waited for adults to act. They never did. She wouldn't let that happen to Phoebe. Not while she was still breathing. Meredith made her decision in 30 seconds. She would take Phoebe out of the mansion tonight, even if it meant standing against the full force of Jasper Blackwood's empire. Even if it meant paying for it with her own life. At 1:30 in the morning, Meredith moved with the precision of someone who had been preparing for this moment her entire life without ever knowing it. She pulled a small black backpack from beneath the bed, something she always kept ready no matter where she lived. It was a habit born from her foster care years, when she had learned that life could change in an instant, and that the one who knew how to run fastest would be the one who survived. Inside the backpack, the essentials were already waiting: neatly folded clothes, a little cash, and a few personal items. She opened the drawer and added the money she had managed to save over the past 3 months. Not much, but enough to get far away. She slipped through Phoebe's room and gathered a few changes of clothes for the child, along with several cartons of milk and some crackers from the playroom. Everything was packed into the small bag now resting on her shoulder. The company phone lay on the table. Meredith looked at it for a moment and then left it where it was. She knew that in Jasper Blackwood's world, every device could be tracked. That phone would become the chain around her ankle if she brought it with her. Instead, she took out her old phone, the one she had kept but never used, and slipped it into her pocket. At least it wasn't part of the Blackwood system. Over the past 3 months, Meredith had observed everything in this mansion without ever intending to. She observed because it was instinct, because it was how she had survived the years when no one protected her. Now those observations had become her only advantage. The guards made their rounds every 15 minutes, beginning at the front gate, moving along the eastern fence, circling the back garden, and then returning again. At this moment, they were on the eastern side, which meant she had about 7 minutes before they reached the back grounds. Cameras were posted at the front entrance, the rear door through the garden, and all along the main corridor. But there was one blind spot: the back kitchen door, where a camera had broken the week before after someone accidentally spilled water into the system. The technician hadn't come to repair it yet because Genevieve had said there was no hurry. Meredith hadn't known then why Genevieve had said that, but now she understood. Perhaps it had been part of Genevieve's plan, an escape route for anything she didn't want recorded. But tonight, it would become Meredith's way out. At 1:45 in the morning, she stepped into Phoebe's room. The child was asleep, her face peaceful in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. Meredith knelt beside the bed, placed a hand on the little girl's shoulder, and gently shook her awake. "Phoebe, wake up, sweetheart." The brown eyes slowly opened, not startled, not tearful. Phoebe looked at Meredith in the darkness, and in that moment Meredith realized that this 4-year-old child understood something without needing it explained. As though the two of them spoke the same language, the language of those who had learned fear far too early. Meredith spoke in the softest whisper, her voice calm, even though her heart was hammering wildly. "We are going somewhere new, but you have to stay very quiet. No talking, no crying. Can you do that?" Phoebe nodded without asking why, without demanding an explanation. She reached for the old teddy bear, clutched it tightly to her chest, and then lifted her arms toward Meredith, ready. Meredith picked Phoebe up, letting the child wrap her arms around her neck and bury her face against her shoulder. She slipped the backpack onto her back, drew in one deep breath, and stepped out of the room. At 2:00 in the morning, they began moving through the darkness. Meredith walked slowly, one step at a time, avoiding the squares of moonlight spread across the floor through the windows. Every step felt as heavy as bricks, every small sound echoing like thunder in the silence of the mansion. Phoebe didn't stir, didn't make a single sound, as though the child had become part of Meredith herself. They crossed the second-floor hallway and went down the back staircase used by the staff. Meredith counted every step, remembering which boards creaked and avoiding them by instinct. Through the sitting room, the wall clock ticked with steady rhythm, like the sound of a countdown to disaster. Near the kitchen door, Meredith heard something. The sharp click of high heels on wood. Someone was coming. Her heart missed a beat. She pulled Phoebe into the shadows behind a large cabinet in the dining room, one hand covering her own mouth to keep even her breathing from making a sound. Phoebe held on to her tighter, pressing her face deep into Meredith's shoulder, as though she wanted to disappear completely. Genevieve's figure appeared in the dim light spilling from the kitchen. The woman stepped inside, opened the refrigerator, and poured herself a glass of water. She stood there drinking slowly, as though she had all the time in the world, never knowing that only a few feet away, her prey was trembling in the dark. 2 minutes passed, like 2 hours. Meredith didn't dare breathe, didn't dare move, only prayed that Phoebe would remain silent. At last, Genevieve set the glass down, turned, and walked out of the kitchen. The sound of her heels faded again, and then vanished completely as she went back upstairs. Meredith waited one more full minute, making certain there was no other sound. Then she stepped out of the darkness and moved toward the kitchen door. At 2:15 in the morning, Meredith's hand closed around the kitchen doorknob. She was shaking so badly she could barely turn it. She drew in one breath, forced herself to be still, and pushed the door open. No alarm, no shrieking siren, only the darkness of the back garden stretched before her, and the distant lights near the front gate. The night air was cold enough to cut through skin, but Meredith felt nothing except a wave of fierce relief. She held Phoebe close, stepped through the doorway, and began to run. She ran across the back garden, ran toward the last fence, and never looked back. Behind her stood Blackwood Manor, the world of power and death. Ahead lay darkness, uncertainty, and the fragile possibility of life. But Meredith wasn't afraid. She had lived her entire life inside darkness, and tonight, darkness would become her shelter. Meredith ran through the rear garden of the mansion, avoiding the pools of light cast by the security lamps, the way one avoids patches of deadly fire. Phoebe clung tightly to her neck without making a single sound, as though the 4-year-old child understood that silence, in this moment, meant survival. They ran past perfectly trimmed rose bushes, past the fountain standing silent in the darkness, heading toward the tall fence at the far edge of the property. The iron fence stood nearly 7 feet high, but in the southwest corner there was a lower section where the fence met the old stone wall. Meredith had noticed that spot during the times she took Phoebe on walks through the garden, storing it away the way she stored everything else, as a survival habit she had never imagined she would truly need. She set Phoebe down and whispered softly, "Hold on tight to Mary's back, sweetheart. Don't let go." Phoebe nodded and climbed onto Meredith's back like a little koala. Meredith began to climb, her hands gripping the freezing iron bars, her feet searching for footholds in the dark. A sharp edge scraped across her palm, and she felt the sting at once, blood welling up and making her hand slick. But she didn't stop. There was no time for pain. A few seconds later, they were on the other side of the fence, falling into a bed of dead leaves in the strip of woods behind the mansion. Meredith got to her feet, picked Phoebe up again, and kept running. The trees sheltered them. The darkness became an ally instead of an enemy. Branches lashed across Meredith's face. Thorns clawed at her legs. But she didn't slow down. She ran until her lungs felt ready to burst, until her legs could barely carry her one more step. The first 3 kilometers passed like a nightmare with no end. When they finally reached the main road, the sky was still black. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the world seemed fast asleep, and only the hum of insects and Meredith's ragged breathing broke the silence. She walked quickly along the shoulder, her eyes constantly scanning the road around them. Every time headlights appeared in the distance, her heart tightened. She pulled Phoebe into the roadside brush and held her breath until the car had passed. No one stopped. No one noticed. They were only 2 small shadows in an enormous night. The bus stop appeared around a bend in the road, beside a convenience store that had already closed, its neon sign only half lit and flickering weakly. Meredith led Phoebe to the rotting wooden bench beneath the shelter and felt the night's cold sink into her bones. Phoebe was shivering now, her lips pale. Meredith took off her own thin coat, wrapped it around the child, and pulled her close. "Where are we going, Mary?" Phoebe asked softly, her voice trembling from cold and fear. Meredith held her tighter, trying to keep her voice steady, even though her heart felt as though it were breaking apart. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere no one will find us." At 4 o'clock in the morning, the night bus appeared in the distance, its yellow headlights glaring through the darkness. It pulled to a stop, and the doors opened. A gray-haired driver looked down at them from above, his eyes searching their faces. "Where are you 2 headed at this hour?" he asked, his tone not friendly, but not hostile either. Meredith answered, trying to sound normal even though her hand was still smeared with blood from the gash she had gotten climbing the fence. "We are going to visit family. The little one couldn't sleep, so we left early." The driver studied them for another moment, then let out a long sigh. He had driven the night route long enough to witness every kind of story. People running, people searching, people with nowhere else to go. He didn't ask another question. He only nodded and let them board. Meredith guided Phoebe to the back row, sat down, and drew the child into her arms. A few other passengers glanced their way and then looked elsewhere. At this hour, everyone had their own story. No one cared much about somebody else's. The bus pulled away, and the landscape began to slide past the window. Blackwood Manor, the woods, the dark road, all of it slowly fell behind them. Phoebe looked up at Meredith, her brown eyes carrying a seriousness that didn't belong on the face of a 4-year-old child. "We are not going back, are we, Mary?" Meredith looked down at her and held her closer. "No, never." At 5 o'clock in the morning, the first light began to rise along the horizon, staining the sky with pale violet and orange. Dawn was coming, and Meredith knew that once the sun rose, everything would change. Genevieve would discover that Phoebe was gone. She would scream, accuse Meredith, call Jasper, and Jasper Blackwood, the mafia boss who controlled half the east coast of America, would hunt them with every resource at his command. Meredith needed a place to hide. She searched through her pocket for the old phone and remembered a detail she had seen in Phoebe's emergency file when she first took the job. Walter Morrison, final contact. Beside the name was a note. Contact only in the most dangerous situation. Was this dangerous enough? Meredith looked at Phoebe asleep in her arms, looked at the growing light of dawn chasing away the dark, looked at the waking world rising all around them. She didn't know who Walter Morrison was. She didn't know whether he would help them. She didn't know whether this was the right decision, but she had no other choice left. She pressed the number and lifted the phone to her ear. The line began to ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Then someone answered. "I am Phoebe Blackwood's nanny. The little girl is in danger." Meredith spoke quickly, trying to keep her voice steady even though her heart was pounding out of control. Silence filled the other end of the line. 10 seconds passed, long as eternity. Meredith almost thought the person had hung up, or that she had dialed the wrong number, or that all of this had been nothing more than a desperate hope. Then a man's voice rose at last, deep and rough, the voice of someone who had lived through far too much to be easily surprised anymore. "Who is threatening the child?" "Mr. Blackwood's fiancé. She wants to." Meredith swallowed hard, trying to find words for the terrible thing she had heard. "She wants to hurt Phoebe. I heard her plan. Tomorrow. I mean today. She is going to stage an accident." Silence again. This time it was longer, heavier. Meredith could hear the man's breathing on the other end, slow and even, as if he were weighing something in his mind. She didn't know that Walter Morrison was standing inside his seaside cabin, looking out the window where the rising dawn was painting the ocean red, remembering a world he had left behind 8 years earlier. He had sworn he would never involve himself in the affairs of the Blackwood family again. He had served Jasper's father for 20 years, had witnessed too much blood and too many tears, had watched too many people die for power and ambition. When the elder Blackwood died and Jasper took control, Walter stepped away, retreating to this small town to live out the rest of his days in peace. But Phoebe, Walter remembered the night the child was born. He remembered holding that tiny life in his arms, while her mother drew her final breath on the operating table. Jasper had fallen apart completely, unable to look at his daughter's face because the pain was too great. Walter had been the only one beside Phoebe in those first days, until Jasper found the strength to face being a father. "Where are you?" Walter asked, and his voice had changed now, harder, firmer, filled with decision. "On a bus, heading north," Meredith answered, looking out through the window as the bus moved past pale fields washed in dawn light. "Rockland Bus Station, Maine, 9 o'clock this morning. I will be waiting." The line went dead. Meredith stared at the phone in her hand, not knowing whether she should feel relieved or even more afraid. She didn't know who Walter Morrison was. She didn't know whether he could be trusted. She didn't know whether this might be a trap, but she had no other choice left. 4 hours on the bus passed like torture. Phoebe slept in Meredith's arms, her little face peaceful in sleep, unaware that the whole world had been turned upside down. Meredith didn't sleep. Her eyes stayed fixed on every person who boarded or stepped off the bus, studying every face, every movement. Any one of them could have been one of Blackwood's men, a man in a suit reading a newspaper in the row ahead, a middle-aged woman who kept glancing in their direction, a young man wearing headphones, though his eyes kept moving restlessly around the bus. Meredith trusted no one. She didn't dare trust anyone. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the bus pulled into Rockland Station. Meredith carried Phoebe down the steps and breathed in the sharp salt air of the sea. It was a small, peaceful town, with pastel-painted wooden houses and fishing boats anchored in the harbor. It felt so far removed from the world of Blackwood Manor that it might as well have belonged to another planet. She looked around, her heart beating fast. Then she saw him. A man stood beside an old, dark green pickup truck, his hair white as snow, his back straight as a soldier's despite his age. His eyes were sharp, sweeping across the crowd once before settling on Meredith and Phoebe. Walter Morrison walked toward them, neither hurried nor slow. He looked at Phoebe first, long and carefully, as though searching for something in the face of the half-awake child. Only then did he turn his gaze to Meredith, his expression probing but not hostile. "She looks like her mother." That was the first thing Walter said, his voice low and far away. "Get in the truck. We shouldn't stay here long." Walter's house stood at the edge of town, far from any main road, hidden among tall pine trees with the distant sound of the ocean rolling in from somewhere beyond. It was simple, solid, with no cameras, no electric fence, no guards on patrol. But Meredith understood the moment she saw the way Walter moved, the way he watched the world around him, the way his hands were always ready, that he himself was the line of defense. He laid down the rules as soon as they stepped into the house, his voice leaving no room for argument. "No one knows you are here. No acquaintances, no friends, no one at all. Not even Jasper." Meredith frowned. "But Mr. Blackwood is Phoebe's father. He needs to know his daughter is in danger." Walter turned and looked at her, his eyes carrying the weariness of a man who had seen too much tragedy. "Jasper won't believe you. He will believe his fiancée over a nanny who has only been here for 3 months. He will think you kidnapped his daughter, and you won't live long enough to explain yourself." Meredith fell silent, because she knew he was right. "We need time," Walter continued. "Time to find proof against that woman, or time for Jasper to see the truth on his own. Until then, the little girl is safer here, where no one will find her." Meredith nodded and looked at Phoebe, curled up on the old sofa in the sitting room, fast asleep with her teddy bear clutched tight in her arms. The child's face was peaceful, more peaceful than it had been in days, and Meredith realized that, for the first time in 26 years of life, she had a place where she could stay. During the first month in Rockland, Meredith learned how to disappear. Walter taught her everything he knew about living beneath the radar, lessons gathered over 20 years of serving in the underworld. No social media, no contact with anyone from the past, no bank cards that could be traced. Phoebe became Sophie, Meredith's daughter, the child of a single mother fleeing an abusive husband. The story was common enough that no one asked too many questions, and sad enough that no one wanted to dig any deeper. Meredith found work at Martha's small cafe, owned by a 60-year-old widow with silver hair and kind eyes. Martha didn't ask about the past. She only looked at the way Meredith held the little girl close and understood that some stories didn't need to be told. The first year passed slowly, one day at a time, the way wounds gradually begin to heal. Meredith learned how to make coffee, learned how to bake from Martha, learned how to smile again after so many years of forgetting what that even felt like. Phoebe started preschool, started making friends, started laughing with the bright, easy laughter of an ordinary child, instead of carrying the frightened eyes of some small, hunted creature. Walter became an unofficial grandfather, teaching Phoebe how to fish by the pier, telling her stories about the sea and the ships that crossed it. He never once mentioned Jasper or the mansion, or the world both of them had left behind. In the second year, Martha fell ill. The sickness came quickly, and left just as quickly. Only 3 months from the day it was discovered, until the day she drew her last breath. Before she died, she held Meredith's hand, her voice weak though her eyes were still bright. "You are the only one who cares for this place the way I do. Keep it alive, my girl." Martha left the cafe to Meredith in her will, something no one in town had expected, yet no one opposed. Meredith changed the name to Harbor Light Cafe, kept Martha's recipes exactly as they were, but added the pastries she had taught herself to make. Phoebe was 6 years old then, old enough to help with little things like setting napkins on the tables or watering the flowers by the window. The little girl called this place home, and Meredith realized it was the first time in her own life she felt that way too. In the third year, the cafe did well enough for Meredith to open a small bakery right beside it. Phoebe was 7 years old, in first grade, with a best friend named Emma, and she called Meredith Mary in a voice full of love. Not Mom, but no longer Nanny either. It was something in between, something that didn't need a name. Life became as calm as the sea on a windless day. But Meredith never stopped checking the front door lock before bed, never stopped watching the faces of strangers who walked into the cafe, never completely forgot that somewhere out there was a man searching for them. Meanwhile, in another world entirely, Jasper Blackwood returned from Las Vegas on the morning of the 4th day after Meredith fled. The mansion was unnaturally silent. There was no sound of Phoebe laughing from the playroom, no small figure running to greet him at the door. Genevieve stood at the foot of the staircase, tears covering her face, her voice trembling like that of someone who had just lived through something terrible. "The nanny kidnapped Phoebe. I woke up and they were gone. I tried to call you, but no one answered." Jasper's world stopped. In that moment, he was no longer the architect, no longer the mafia boss who controlled half the East Coast. He was only a father who had just lost his only child. The rage came afterward, cold and merciless, like everything Jasper ever did. 50 men were mobilized, sweeping across the city, checking every bus station, airport, and train terminal. Meredith Cole. That name spread through the entire Blackwood network like a warrant. But Meredith Cole might as well have never existed. No trace on social media, no relatives to question, no friends to pressure. She had spent 26 years living like a ghost. And when the time came to vanish, she knew exactly how to do it. 6 months later, when Jasper had nearly lost all hope, one of his men discovered something strange. Genevieve had transferred a large sum of money into an anonymous account just before Phoebe disappeared. Digging deeper, they found messages, phone calls, and an entire plan detailed with chilling precision. A fall down the stairs. Children fall all the time. Jasper read those messages, and his world collapsed for the second time, but in a completely different way. The night he confronted Genevieve, the mansion was silent as death. Jasper didn't shout, and that was far more terrifying. He only stood there, looking at the woman he had intended to marry, his voice cold as ice. "You wanted to harm my daughter," Genevieve tried to explain, tried to cry, tried to beg, but Jasper's deep blue eyes had gone still and lifeless, with no room left for mercy. "Get her out of my sight. Forever." Genevieve vanished from his life that very night, and no one asked where she had gone. In Jasper Blackwood's world, there were questions that didn't need to be asked, and then Jasper understood the cruel truth. Meredith hadn't kidnapped his daughter. She had saved Phoebe. She had done the very thing he, as her father, should have done. She had seen the danger while he was blind. She had acted while he was far away. She had protected his daughter when he had failed. And he had hunted her like a criminal. Every night after that, Jasper stood outside Phoebe's empty bedroom, looking at the teddy bears lined up neatly across the bed, and wondered where his little girl was. 3 years of searching passed like torture, the finest detectives, every resource money could buy. Yet Meredith, Cole, and Phoebe seemed to have vanished from the face of the earth. Jasper became a ghost of himself, no longer caring about the Empire, no longer calculating the next move. He only wanted to find his daughter. Then one day, the final clue appeared. A photograph on the website of a small seaside town in Maine, posted for the summer festival. In one corner of the picture was a cafe, and standing in front of it was a little girl with curly black hair, smiling at someone outside the frame. Jasper stared at the photograph for hours. It was Phoebe. Older, healthier, happier, but unmistakably his Phoebe. He left for Maine that very night, alone, with no bodyguards and no entourage. 2 worlds were about to collide. Meredith had no idea the storm was coming. Jasper didn't know what he would say when he saw his daughter again. Saturday afternoon at Harbor Light Cafe unfolded the way every Saturday afternoon usually did. The shop was busier than usual. Local residents stopping in for coffee after the market. A few travelers pausing along the coastal road, the sound of cheerful conversation mingling with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and waffles just lifted from the iron. Late afternoon sunlight poured through the glass windows, painting warm golden rectangles across the worn wooden floor. Meredith stood behind the counter, her hands moving quickly as she finished a latte for a regular customer, her mouth answering Mrs. Johnson's question about the new apple cake recipe. Over the past 3 years, she had learned how to smile naturally, how to make conversation without stiffness, how to live like an ordinary woman instead of someone on the run. Phoebe was in the kitchen, arranging a tray of freshly baked cookies with the careful concentration of a 7-year-old girl determined to please the grown-ups around her. She wore a little apron decorated with stars, her curly black hair tied high, and every so often she sang along to the melody drifting from the old radio in the corner of the kitchen. Walter sat in his usual place by the window, a cup of black coffee growing cold at his side, the local newspaper spread open in front of him. He came here every day, sat in the same spot, drank the same coffee, as though it were a habit that couldn't be broken. But Meredith knew he didn't come for the coffee. He came to watch, to protect, to make sure that 3 years of hard-won safety wouldn't be shattered in a single careless moment. The bell over the door rang. Meredith looked up automatically, a welcoming smile already waiting on her lips. Then she froze. The man standing in the doorway was taller than anyone else in the room, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, as though he had just stepped out of the pages of a magazine meant for the powerful and wealthy. But it wasn't the suit that made Meredith recognize him. It was the faint scar running from his temple to his cheekbone. It was the deep blue eyes, cold as winter. It was the way he stood, as though the whole world belonged to him, and he was merely allowing it to exist. Jasper Blackwood. 30 seconds of silence stretched into something that felt like 30 years. No one in the cafe knew what was happening. They kept talking, kept sipping coffee, kept laughing as though the world hadn't just stopped turning. But the air had changed. It was tight as a wire pulled to the breaking point, heavy as the sky before a storm. Meredith didn't run. 3 years earlier, she had run, and that had saved Phoebe's life. But now there was nowhere left to run. She didn't scream. She didn't draw attention. Her hands tightened around the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white, but her face held its mask of calm. Jasper stepped forward, each footstep sounding unnaturally loud as the silence began to spread through the cafe, and a few people slowly started to realize that something wasn't right. He didn't look at anyone else. He didn't care about the curious eyes beginning to follow him. His deep blue gaze was fixed on one person alone, Meredith. He stopped about 6 feet from the counter, close enough to speak, far enough not to threaten. 3 years of searching, 3 years of suffering, 3 years of becoming a ghost of himself. All of it gathered into this single moment. Walter rose to his feet. The newspaper fell to the floor, but he didn't pick it up. He moved with surprising speed for a man his age, crossed the cafe, and took his place behind Meredith, shoulders straight, eyes sharp, carrying the posture of a soldier ready for battle even after years of retirement. He didn't say a word, but the message was clear as daylight. If you want to get to her, you go through me first. Jasper looked at Walter, and for the briefest moment, surprise flickered in his eyes before it gave way to understanding. Of course, Walter Morrison, the only man capable of helping them disappear completely from his radar. You hid them for 3 years, Jasper said, his voice without emotion, simply stating the truth. Walter answered in a voice low and hard as stone. I protected your granddaughter. The thing you should have done yourself. The words struck Jasper like a blade driven straight into his chest. But his face didn't change. The customers in the cafe had begun to murmur. A few stood. A few discreetly reached for their phones, as though ready to call the police. Meredith realized she had to act before the situation slipped beyond control. She cleared her throat and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear while keeping her voice calm. I'm sorry, everyone. This is a family matter. Could you please give us a few minutes? The cafe emptied slowly. People rose, left money on the tables, and quietly moved toward the door with worried and curious glances over their shoulders. When the last customer stepped outside, the door closed, leaving behind a heavy silence inside the little cafe. Then came a sound from the kitchen. The kitchen door opened, and Phoebe stepped out, flour still dusting her hands, her face full of confusion at the strange stillness. She saw the man standing in the middle of the cafe, and her brown eyes widened. Not a stranger. Familiar, deeply familiar. Memories from 3 years earlier began to stir, blurred images of the grand mansion, the room filled with toys, the man seated at the head of the dinner table, with the same deep blue eyes now looking at her. Phoebe stood motionless in the kitchen doorway, neither stepping forward nor retreating. 3 adults stood in the middle of the cafe, strung tight as wires ready to snap. The child stood at the kitchen door, small and silent, like the still center of a storm. And the question hung in the air, heavier than anything else. What would happen next? Jasper spoke first, and only a single word left his lips. Why? His voice wasn't angry the way Meredith had imagined through all 3 years. There was no threat in it, no cold authority of a mafia kingpin. There was only the deep exhaustion of a man worn thin by searching, by suffering, by the endless punishment he had inflicted on himself. 3 years contained within a single word. He wasn't asking about what had happened. He already knew that now. He had uncovered the truth about Genevieve, had come to understand the dark conspiracy hidden beneath the perfect smile of the woman he had intended to marry. What he was asking was why Meredith had dared to act, why she had dared to make the decision in his place, why she had dared to take his daughter so far away. Meredith looked straight into his eyes, without flinching, without fear. You already know what Genevieve did. You already know I heard that phone call. I don't need to tell it again. She paused for a moment and drew in a deep breath. The real question is why I didn't wait for you to come back. Why I didn't believe you would fix it. Jasper said nothing. He only waited. And Meredith began to speak, her voice steady, yet carrying the weight of an entire lifetime of pain she had never told anyone before. Because I spent my whole childhood waiting for adults to save me. No one came. Not once. She stopped for a moment, memories rising like a tide. I was 8 years old, lying in a hospital bed after the fire that killed my parents. I waited for someone to come claim me, a relative, a family friend, anyone at all. I waited for weeks. No one came. 7 foster families after that, and not one of them stayed long enough for me to call them family. Meredith looked at Jasper, and there was no hatred in her eyes, only the painful understanding of how the world worked. So when I heard Genevieve planning a fall down the stairs, I didn't wait. I didn't hope that someone would believe me. I didn't leave Phoebe's fate in the hands of adults who might or might not act in time. I wasn't going to let that happen to her, not when there was something I could do. Jasper stood there, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. He wasn't angry with Meredith. How could he be angry with her when she had done what he had failed to do? He was angry with himself, angry that he had missed the calls that night, angry that he hadn't answered when she tried to reach him, angry that he had trusted Genevieve blindly while that woman had been plotting to murder his daughter. Walter cut in, his voice low and hard as iron. She tried to call your security line. They didn't believe her. They said she was slandering the boss's fiancé, said they would file a report in the morning. Jasper closed his eyes for a brief moment, and pain showed clearly across a face that was usually cold as stone. She called you 3 times, Walter continued, with no intention of forgiving Jasper's failure. You didn't answer. You were busy with your deal in Las Vegas while your daughter was about to be killed inside your own house. If she hadn't run that night, you wouldn't be standing here now. You'd be standing at your daughter's grave. Jasper didn't argue. There was nothing to argue with. It was the truth, naked and merciless. Meredith looked at him, her voice calmer now but no less sharp. So what is it you want, Mr. Blackwood? Do you want to punish me for saving your daughter? I was ready for that 3 years ago. Every day I woke up, I knew that today might be the day you found us. She stepped forward, facing the mafia boss without the slightest tremor in her body. Or do you want to take Phoebe away? You have that right. You're her father. Your blood runs through her veins. The law would stand with you. But before you decide, look around this place. Ask yourself one question. Are you prepared to destroy what she has built here? Jasper looked around the little cafe for the first time since he had walked in. He saw the photographs on the wall. Phoebe laughing brightly in fishing clothes, standing beside Walter on the pier. Phoebe in front of the cafe on opening day, wearing a tiny apron and holding a cookie in her hand. Phoebe and Meredith wrapped in each other's arms beneath a Christmas tree while snow fell white outside the window. Then he saw the crayon drawing taped to the wall near the register. The clumsy lines of a child and the shaky, handwritten words, "My home." For the first time in 3 years, Jasper saw the life his daughter had lived without him. And it wasn't a life of sorrow. It was happiness, Meredith continued, her voice softening, though it lost none of its strength. For the last 3 years, I've raised her. I stayed up through the night when her fever ran high, held her until it broke. I taught her how to read, taught her how to write, sat beside her for hours while she did her homework. I'm the one she calls when she's afraid. I'm the one she runs to when she's happy. Every breakfast, every dinner, every bedtime story. She stopped and looked directly into Jasper's eyes. You are her father. Blood can't be denied. But you weren't there. It isn't entirely your fault, I understand that. But the truth is still the truth. The room fell silent. Jasper stood there, the man who controlled an empire, the man people called the architect, the man who never showed emotion, and for the first time in many years, his voice trembled. I didn't come here to punish you, he said, each word sounding as though it had been pulled painfully from his chest. I came to thank you. For doing what I failed to do, for protecting my daughter when I wasn't there. He swallowed hard, trying to steady a voice threatening to break apart. I only wanted to see my little girl, to know that she's all right. To see her with my own eyes, not through a photograph on the website of some small town. Jasper lifted his head, and the deep blue eyes that were usually cold as ice were now filled with pain. I know I don't deserve it. I know I failed as a father. But Phoebe is all I have. She is the only thing left in my life that means anything. The room sank into silence. Meredith said nothing. Walter said nothing either. The air was heavy as lead, and then from the kitchen doorway came a small voice, breaking the stillness. Mary? Everyone turned. Phoebe stood at the threshold, 7 years old now, yet carrying eyes older than her age, looking at the man she had once called Daddy. Phoebe stepped out from the kitchen doorway slowly, but without hesitation. 7 years old, with curly black hair and brown eyes fixed directly on the man standing in the middle of her cafe. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't trembling. She had lived through too much in the first 4 years of her life to still fear the things she could plainly see. Phoebe stopped beside Meredith, her tiny hand slipping into Meredith's, but she didn't hide behind her the way she once had. She stood there with her shoulders straight, her eyes never leaving the stranger who wasn't truly a stranger at all. Jasper looked at his daughter, and it felt as though a hand had closed around his chest and squeezed. Phoebe was so much older than the blurred memory he had carried with him for 3 long years. She was no longer the silent 4-year-old child, no longer the tiny girl who hid behind the legs of grown-ups with fear in her eyes. Standing before him now was a child who had grown, who had suffered and survived, whose gaze carried her mother's warmth and his own strength, yet was also entirely her own in a way he couldn't name. You're my daddy, aren't you? Phoebe asked, her voice clear and bright, but not innocent. It wasn't the question of a confused child. It was the question of someone who already knew the answer and only wanted it confirmed. Jasper nodded, his throat so tight he could barely make a sound. He looked at his daughter, the little girl who carried half his blood, the child he had searched for across 3 endless years, and all he could do was nod. I remember you, Phoebe said slowly, as though she were reaching into a faraway place inside her memory. You sat at the head of the table. You had blue eyes. You kissed my forehead before you left for work. She paused, her gaze never moving from Jasper. But you weren't here. 3 years. You weren't here. Each word struck Jasper like a blade driven into his heart. He sank to his knees so that his eyes were level with his daughter's. No longer the towering mafia boss standing above everyone else, only a father trying to reach the child he had lost. I'm sorry. His voice shook, the first time it had done so in decades. I should have protected you. I should have seen what was happening. I failed you. Phoebe looked at him, and there was no anger in her eyes, but there wasn't easy forgiveness either. There was only the plain honesty of a child who had learned that actions mattered more than words. Mary protected me, she said, her voice steady and certain. That night, Mary carried me out of the house. Mary stayed awake to watch over me on the bus. Mary taught me how to read, taught me how to bake, held me when I had bad dreams. Phoebe turned and looked at Walter. Walter taught me how to fish. He taught me how to swim. He told me stories about the sea. He made me a little wooden boat and said that one day I would have a real one. Then she looked around the cafe, her eyes resting on the pictures on the wall, on the crayon drawing she had made, on the little chair where she usually sat to do her homework after school. I have a home here, Phoebe said, each sentence like another brick placed carefully into the wall she had spent 3 years building. I have friends. I have school. I have a bedroom with stars on the ceiling. I have a beach to play on every weekend. She looked back at Jasper, her brown eyes steady and unblinking. I don't want to leave. Jasper looked at his daughter. And for the first time in his life, he understood that there were things power couldn't buy, things commands couldn't achieve. He was the architect, the man who calculated every move 10 steps ahead. But there was no blueprint for this. No plan for the moment when his daughter looked into his eyes and told him she had found home somewhere else. Jasper asked softly, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. Would you want me to come visit? Phoebe didn't answer right away. She looked at Meredith, as though asking for guidance, then at Walter, and only then back at Jasper. She thought about it for a long time, not rushing to answer just to please anyone. Will you promise to come when you say you will? Phoebe asked. Not whenever you feel like it. Not come and then disappear again. Come on the exact day you say you will. Jasper nodded without hesitation. I promise. Phoebe studied him for a few more moments, as though weighing whether that promise was worth trusting. Then she nodded. Then you can come visit. Meredith spoke, her voice calm, but leaving no room for argument. She stays here. This is her home. You have the right to visit, but on our terms. Walter stepped forward and stood beside Meredith and Phoebe. On a fixed schedule. Supervised. And only if the child agrees. Nothing will be forced. Jasper rose slowly to his feet and looked at the 3 people standing before him. The woman who had saved his daughter, the man who had sheltered them for 3 years, and the little girl who was no longer little anymore. For the first time in his life, Jasper Blackwood wasn't in control of the situation. For the first time, he stood in the position of the man who had to accept, instead of the man who set the terms, and he nodded. All right. He walked toward the door, each step heavy. At the threshold, he stopped and turned back to Meredith. Thank you. His voice was low and sincere in a way he had never spoken to anyone before, for doing what I couldn't. Then he looked at Phoebe, and his deep blue eyes softened in a way he hadn't believed was still possible. I'll come back. Next month. On time. The door closed behind him, leaving silence inside the cafe. Phoebe was still holding Meredith's hand, her little fingers tightening just a bit more. Mary, did I do the right thing? Meredith knelt down and pulled her into her arms, breathing in the scent of flower and the faint trace of the sea still caught in the child's hair. You did exactly the right thing. You made your own choice. No one made it for you. That's what matters most. For the first time in many long, tense hours, Phoebe smiled. The smile of a 7-year-old child who had just come through a trial that many grown adults couldn't have faced. And Meredith understood, in that moment, that family isn't the one who gives you life. Family is the one you choose to live it with. 5 years after that fateful afternoon, Harbor Light Cafe was no longer the small, modest coffee shop tucked quietly on the corner of the street. By then, it had become a chain of 3 stores stretched along the coast of Maine, with more than 20 employees and a reputation that had reached far beyond the small town of Rockland. The local paper had once run a long feature on Meredith, the woman who built a small empire from nothing, the single mother who never revealed the mysterious past she carried inside her. They didn't know the real story. They only knew that she made the finest coffee in Maine and that her waffles could bring people to tears with happiness. Meredith was 34 now, her hair still chestnut brown, though a few silver strands had begun to appear at her temples. quiet signs of the years spent balancing motherhood with the weight of building a business. She wasn't the young woman running through the night anymore. She was a woman who had built a life from ashes. Not once, but many times. Phoebe was 12, nearly as tall as Meredith, with a cloud of curly black hair and bright brown eyes full of light. She was no longer the silent child who hid behind the legs of adults. Phoebe was now the top student in her class, captain of the girls' basketball team at school, and part of a close circle of friends she called the Four Sisters, even though none of them shared a single drop of blood. After school, Phoebe still ran straight to the cafe, slipped on the apron printed with the Harbor Light logo, and helped Meredith in the kitchen the way she had since she was tiny. One evening, while the two of them were cleaning up after closing, Phoebe suddenly asked, "Mary, why did you save me? Back then, you didn't know me. You had only been my nanny for 3 months. Why did you risk your life like that?" Meredith stopped wiping the table and looked at the girl who had grown old enough to understand the truth. "Because no one saved me when I needed it," she said slowly, her voice gentle, yet carrying the full weight of a painful past. "I spent my whole childhood waiting for adults to protect me. No one came, and I didn't want you to spend your childhood waiting the same way. Not when there was something I could do." Walter was 63 now, slower than he had once been, his knees aching whenever the weather turned cold, and sometimes he needed a cane to get around. But his eyes were still as sharp as ever, and he still sat every morning in his familiar place by the window, a steaming cup of black coffee before him. The difference was that now he was no longer the one standing guard. Meredith and Phoebe took care of him, making sure he ate properly, took his medicine on time, and was never alone on bitter winter nights. The circle of protection had turned. The one who had once been the shield had now become the one being sheltered. Jasper came to visit every month just as he had promised, never late, not even once. Those first visits had been awkward and distant. He would sit in the cafe like a stranger who had wandered into the wrong life, not knowing what to say to the daughter who had grown up without him. But time softened everything. He learned how to be a father in a new way, not through control, but through presence, not through commands, but through listening. He taught Phoebe about business, about strategy, about reading people, the things he understood best. And he learned from Meredith about love, about patience, about how to let another human being make her own choices, the things he had never truly known. There were moments Meredith knew she would never forget. The first time Jasper attended a parent-teacher conference at Phoebe's school, the mafia boss, who controlled half the East Coast, sat beside Meredith on a tiny plastic chair, awkward as a new student who didn't know where to put his hands. The first time Phoebe called him Dad after 2 years. Just one soft dad when he drove her to school on a rainy morning. Jasper had to turn his face away and pretend to look out the window so he could hide the tears threatening to rise. The first time the three of them shared dinner together, without the old heavy silence, without the tension, with only Phoebe's laughter, as she told stories about her day at school, and Jasper asking the kinds of questions an ordinary father would ask. The relationship between Jasper and Meredith changed too. From enemies in imagination to allies in reality, there was nothing romantic between them, never had been. Only the deep respect of two people who had walked through hell together to protect a child. Together they made decisions for Phoebe, from choosing schools to deciding whether she could go camping with her friends. One night, after Phoebe had gone to sleep, and the two of them were sitting in the closed cafe talking quietly, Jasper looked at Meredith and said, "You are the best thing that ever happened to my daughter. I don't say that often enough, but I think it every day." Meredith smiled, and her gray-blue eyes softened. "She saved me too. You don't know that. Before Phoebe, I was only existing. After Phoebe, I finally began to live." Phoebe's 12th birthday was celebrated in the cafe, a small party with Walter, Meredith, a few of Phoebe's closest friends, and a birthday cake Meredith had made herself. The bell over the door rang at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and Jasper stepped inside carrying a small gift box wrapped in silver paper. It wasn't something expensive, not a designer bag or the newest phone. He set the box in front of Phoebe and spoke in a low, gentle voice. "Your mother wanted you to have this when you were old enough. I've kept it for 12 years, waiting for today." Phoebe opened the box, and inside was a delicate silver bracelet engraved with a tiny star. It had belonged to her mother, the woman who had died bringing her into the world. Phoebe stared at the bracelet for a long time, then fastened it around her wrist. Then she stood up, walked to Jasper, and wrapped her arms tightly around him. The first time she had done it on her own, the first time no one had needed to encourage her. Meredith watched the scene, her heart catching painfully in her chest. The most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast stood there held tightly by his 12-year-old daughter, and on the face that was usually cold as stone, there was, for the first time, a real smile. Maybe this is what family is, Meredith thought. Not perfect, not like any other family in the world, but theirs, built out of pain, held together by choice. And that was the strongest kind of family there was. On an ordinary evening inside Harbor Light Cafe, the lights outside had already been turned off, and only the soft golden glow from the low-hanging lamps remained inside. Meredith wiped down the last few tables, her movements slow and steady, like a familiar ritual at the close of every working day. Phoebe sat in the corner of the cafe with her math notebook spread open in front of her, her pencil tapping softly against the table in the rhythm of thought. Walter sat in his usual chair by the window, his head nodding forward, the newspaper having slipped from his hand and fallen across his chest, his breathing even in the light drift of sleep. And Jasper sat across from Phoebe, patiently explaining a fractions problem she couldn't understand, his voice low and gentle in a way no one outside this room had ever been allowed to hear. Meredith stopped what she was doing and looked at the scene before her. No one in this room was bound to her by blood. Walter wasn't her father. Jasper wasn't her husband. Phoebe wasn't the child she had given birth to. But looking at them, looking at the way they existed together in the same space with the ease of people who had lived through too much side by side, Meredith knew this was family. The most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast of America was sitting in a tiny cafe in a seaside town, patiently explaining how to find a common denominator to his 12-year-old daughter. The aging former bodyguard was dozing in his chair, his newspaper slipping everywhere, no longer needing to keep watch over anyone, because he knew the people around him would keep watch over him instead. And the little girl who had nearly been destroyed in her own home was laughing softly, because at last the math problem had been solved. Phoebe looked up, her eyes shining. "Mary, tomorrow I have my school performance. Everyone is coming, right? I am singing the solo I've been practicing for a whole month." Walter opened his eyes as if he had never truly been asleep, only resting them. "I'll be sitting in the front row. If anyone thinks they can sit in front of me, they are welcome to try." Jasper nodded, his deep blue eyes gentle as they rested on his daughter. "I'll be there too. I'll fly back from New York in time. You don't need to worry." Meredith smiled, set the dishcloth down on the counter, and walked over to them. "We are going to be the loudest cheering section in the whole school. You'd better be ready for that." Phoebe burst out laughing and pointed at Walter. "Grandpa Walter is going to fall asleep. He falls asleep everywhere." Walter narrowed his eyes at her, his voice pretending to be stern. "I can still hear perfectly well with my eyes closed. I've listened to you practice that song for the past month. I already know it by heart." The whole room filled with laughter, warm and bright in the small space. Meredith looked at them and thought of the road that had brought them here. 8 years earlier, she had been a woman with nothing left to lose, walking into a mafia boss's mansion because she had no other choice. She met a 4-year-old child no one was protecting, and everything changed. Not in the way she had imagined, not in any easy way, but in the deepest way possible. She had once believed family was not meant for her. 7 foster homes, and no one stayed long enough. Her fiancé died before their wedding. Everyone she had ever loved left her, one way or another. She had once believed she had been born to be alone, that happiness was something meant for other people, and never for her. But Phoebe had taught her something different. The little girl who had taken her hand in the darkness 8 years ago had taught her that family is not the place where you are born. Family is the person willing to run with you at 2 o'clock in the morning while the whole world sleeps. Family is the one who opens the door when you have nowhere left to go. Family is the one who shows up exactly when promised, even if it means flying across half the country just to watch a daughter sing one song at school. Family is the one who chooses to stay when they could so easily leave. Meredith switched off the lights in the cafe and let the room sink into the gentle darkness of night. She looked out the window, where the sea stretched peacefully under the moonlight, waves brushing softly against the shore like nature's own lullaby. Phoebe ran over and took her hand, her voice clear and full of joy. "Let's go home, Mary. I'm hungry. What are we having tonight?" Jasper and Walter walked behind them, arguing about last night's football game, the voices of 2 men from completely different worlds who had somehow found common ground in the simplest parts of ordinary life. The 4 of them stepped out of the cafe and into the peaceful night of the seaside town. Not a family bound by blood, Not a family by any traditional definition, but a real family all the same, built out of pain and choice, held together by sacrifice and love, and that is the strongest kind of family there is. If it were you, would you dare to risk everything to protect a child who wasn't your own? Your answer might define who you are. Family is not defined by blood or power. Family is defined by the people willing to sacrifice themselves to protect you. And sometimes, the stranger becomes the one who is closest to your heart. All it takes is the courage to choose. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the final moment. We would truly love to know how you feel after hearing the story of Meredith, Phoebe, Walter, and Jasper. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We always want to hear what is living deep inside your heart. If this story has touched your emotions, please press the like button to support our channel. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss more moving and compelling stories every day. Please share this video with the people you love so they too can hear this story about the true meaning of family. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in each new day. Thank you so much. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video.